Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book. As we open Season 06, Episode 28, exploring Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, we ponder. How did a nation, initially ill-prepared and facing imminent defeat, emerge from the Second World War forever altered, both domestically and on the global stage? Our mission today is to truly unpack that transformative journey of Britain, digging into surprising insights from the source material.
Absolutely. And we'll guide you through, the war's key phases, Britain's struggles, its victories too. And then we'll really get into the profound social, economic, political shifts, the things that reshape the nation and its place in the world. It's a fascinating story, really, how such a massive crisis can fundamentally remake a country.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Britain declares war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. But the source material makes it pretty clear they weren't exactly ready. What was the actual state of preparedness? Or unpreparedness, maybe?
That's a really critical point. The government knew saving Poland directly wasn't really feasible. Lord Halifax put it quite starkly back in March 39. He said, basically, if Hitler keeps going, we should attack Germany, not in order to save a particular victim, but in order to put down a bully. So the aim was broader. Stop Hitler, destroy Nazi power, militarily. Yeah, it was a mixed picture. Huge defense cuts after World War I meant forces were, stagnant, focused on the empire. By 1938, believe it or not, the Royal Navy, Britain's traditional strong arm, was maybe the weakest of the three services. The Army had made some progress, mechanization, and so on, but it was really the RAF, the Royal Air Force, that was the most modern and expanding fastest.
Right. So after declaring war, there's this period people called the phony war. Sort of an eerie quiet, wasn't it? What was actually happening then and what shattered that illusion?
Yeah, phony war, that term came from American journalists, actually. It reflected the lack of big battles in Western Europe initially. While Britain and France couldn't do much for Poland directly, French mobilization was slow. Germany unleashed its terrifying new tactic, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks, motorized divisions, all coordinated, crucially, with massive air support. The Luftwaffe just pulverized Poland's infrastructure, Britain's response, mostly blockading German ports, sending troops over to France. There were some naval wins early on, like sinking the Graf Spee, but the U-boats immediately showed their danger. Sinking the battleship Royal Oak was a shock, that quiet period. It ended very abruptly. April 1940, Hitler occupies Denmark and Norway. That was the rude awakening. Allied attempts to push them out failed badly, mainly because they had no air cover, just constant harassment from the German Air Force.
And that Norway campaign wasn't just a military loss, was it? It had huge political fallout back in London. What happened in Parliament?
Oh, absolutely massive fallout. The Norway failure just starkly revealed the incompetence within Chamberlain's government. Churchill himself, who was in the war cabinet then, said they'd been forestalled, surprised, and outwitted.
Yeah.
The debate in Parliament was vicious. Lots of conservatives turned on Chamberlain. Leo Amory delivered that killer line, quoting Cromwell, "In the name of God, go." Chamberlain's support just collapsed. He resigned. And Churchill, surprisingly perhaps, formed a new government literally the same day, May 10th, that Hitler invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Quite a moment.
So May 1940, Winston Churchill steps in, a figure many thought was, frankly, washed up politically. What was his reputation just before this, and what kind of leader did he actually turn out to be right when Britain needed him most?
It's an amazing turnaround, isn't it? He's 65, his career, seen by many as largely a failure. Tony Pandy, Gallipoli a disaster, revaluing the pound wrongly, his tough stance in the general strike, opposing the India Act, even backing Edward VIII during the abdication. Plus, he'd switched parties twice. People saw him as unreliable. But, and this is key, despite all that, he'd been the loudest voice warning about Hitler, demanding rearmament. As A.J.P. Taylor said, it felt like all his life had been an unconscious preparation for this hour. And what did he do? He immediately formed a truly national government. Pulled everyone in, Chamberlain, Halifax, labor leaders like Attlee and Greenwood, Beaverbrook, Bevan, Morrison, a real coalition. And it was incredibly effective, guiding Britain when it stood completely alone against Germany and Italy for that critical year, June 40 to June 41. The Emergency Powers Act gave them almost total power, shows how desperate things were.
It's fascinating, Churchill, the arch-conservative in many ways, leading what one historian calls the first working socialist government. What does that tell us about crisis forcing pragmatism, especially given his reputation?
It's a fantastic point. A.N. Wilson, who you mentioned, he highlights that forming this national government was one of Churchill's huge achievements. Faced with potential annihilation, political labels didn't matter so much, bringing people like Attlee and Ernest Bevin, major labor figures, into powerful roles. It wasn't about ideology then, it was about survival. Pure pragmatism. It demonstrated that under extreme pressure, national unity and mobilizing everything people, industry just trumped the old political divides. And yeah, it set a surprising precedent for post-war Britain.
And beyond pulling the politicians together, his actual war leadership, there's been a lot of historical debate, hasn't there? What are some of the main criticisms, and how do historians balance those against his iconic status?
Oh, it's a really vigorous debate. You've got critics like Andrew Roberts and John Charmley who make the controversial case that Churchill maybe should have sought peace in 1940. Their argument, essentially, is that fighting on led to Hitler's defeat, yes, but inadvertently allowed Stalin, who they saw as a bigger long-term threat, to dominate Eastern Europe.
That's a provocative thought.
It is, but then you have more balanced views, like in Churchill, a major new assessment, which acknowledge mistakes but argue they don't lessen his greatness. David Reynolds puts it well. The mistakes make him a more human and thereby a more impressive figure. A.N. Wilson, again, points to two other key achievements beyond the national government. First, that incredible rhetoric in 1940, the Dunkirk spirit, it absolutely stiffened resolve when things look hopeless, made people believe victory was possible. Second, his refusal to launch a second front in France too early, before 1944. He learned the hard way from the Dieppe raid disaster. Now, he wasn't perfect strategically. He really underestimated Japan's strength, leading to disasters like Singapore, losses in Libya, and he was slow on the uptake about air power supporting naval operations, like the Crete disaster showed. But, as Michael Carver pointed out, his constant, ceaseless prodding kept the military leaders on their toes, pushed them to improve, and ultimately, his huge personality, that sheer will to win, it gave Britain a psychological edge it desperately needed. His speeches, blood, toil, tears, and sweat, victory at all costs, they genuinely rallied the nation.
So Churchill's in charge. France collapses almost immediately. And then there's Dunkirk. It became this potent symbol of defiance, didn't it? But what's the real story behind the myth?
Yeah, Germany's Blitzkrieg just ripped through the Low Countries in France in May 1940. Rotterdam was bombed horrifically, Belgium surrendered, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of British and French troops are trapped at Dunkirk, sea at their backs. What the Royal Navy pulled off was, well, remarkable. They evacuated over 338,000 troops, mostly British, between late May and early June, under constant Luftwaffe attack. Hitler's weird halt order on May 24th probably helped. Maybe the ground wasn't right for tanks, but Churchill spun it brilliantly, turned a retreat into this symbol of the Dunkirk spirit. Huge for morale. The reality, though, a massive blow. The army lost almost all its heavy equipment, its vehicles, everything, and the government unfairly scapegoated King Leopold of Belgium and the French for the speed of the collapse.
That's incredible, turning defeat into defiance like that. But the sources mention something even more surprising, that behind closed doors, the British cabinet was actually talking about peace with Hitler. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is genuinely startling stuff. The public had no idea then, and it's still hard for some to grasp. But yes, late May 1940, France is collapsing, and the war cabinet seriously debated negotiating peace with Nazi Germany. Churchill, absolutely adamant. Fight on. But Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was convinced it was hopeless. He actively pushed for using Mussolini as a mediator. And who tipped the balance? It was Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, the labor leaders Churchill had brought in. They stood firmly with Churchill. They outmaneuvered Halifax. That internal fight was absolutely pivotal. It ensured Britain stayed in the war. Halifax. He got shipped off as ambassador to the U.S. not long after. Maybe convenient timing, eh?
Wow. Okay, so Britain decides to fight on alone, facing invasion, the Battle of Britain. How on earth did they pull off that victory against what seemed like impossible odds?
Exactly. France was gone. Hitler starts gathering barges for Operation Celian, the invasion. But his navy wasn't strong enough to guarantee a crossing, so the job fell to the Luftwaffe. Destroy the RAF, control the skies over the Channel. Churchill delivers that famous speech. This was their finest hour. Initially, the Luftwaffe hit Channel shipping, then RAF airfields the crucial targets, but then Goering, the Luftwaffe chief, made a massive mistake. After a small British raid on Berlin, he furiously switched tactics, started bombing London instead. Retaliation, trying to break civilian morale. But strategically, it was a blunder. It took the pressure off the vital RAF fighter bases, gave them breathing room to repair and rearm.
So what were the key factors in the British victory then?
Several things came together. First, radar. A chain of 51 radar stations gave crucial early warning. The Germans just didn't grasp how important it was. Second, logistics. German fighters, the Messerschmitts, only had fuel for a few minutes over London before needing to head back. Third, production. British factories were churning out Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than the Germans could replace their losses. The RAF always had reserves. And finally, leadership and skill. Air Marshals Dowding and Park used their forces brilliantly. And the pilots, incredible bravery and skill. Churchill's tribute sums it up. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And the impact, huge. First time the Germans were really stopped, showed they weren't invincible, forced Hitler to postpone, then cancel the invasion, and ultimately pushed him towards fighting on two fronts by invading Russia. A major turning point.
Okay, so Britain secures the home front, but the war just keeps expanding. It goes global, pulls the empire in. Where were the next major flashpoints, and what were the turning points that started to, turn the tide?
Right, the war definitely widened. The Mediterranean became crucial. Mussolini invaded Greece in the late 1940, got bogged down, and forced German intervention in 41. That actually delayed Hitler's invasion of Russia by several vital weeks, maybe saving Moscow that winter. North Africa, too. Mussolini invaded Egypt from Libya. General Wavell had some early successes for the British, but then Churchill diverted troops to that doomed Greek campaign. And then Rommel arrived with his Africa Corps. Big problems for the British. And throughout this, the little island of Malta was incredibly important, a vital base under constant bombing, just hanging on to disrupt Axis supply lines. But the real turning point in North Africa, El Alamein, October 1942, Montgomery's 8th Army finally pushes Rommel back decisively. Why? Overwhelming Allied numbers, and crucially, total air superiority hammering Axis troops and supplies. The importance of El Alamein, immense. Stopped the Germans getting the Suez Canal, ended any chance of Axis forces linking up across the Middle East, led to the Axis being kicked out of North Africa entirely, which then paved the way for invading Italy. It also sucked in German resources they desperately needed elsewhere.
Success in North Africa, then. But the Far East? That sounds like a completely different story. A disaster, you called it. Why were those territories so poorly defended? Was it just a miscalculation?
An absolute disaster, yes, and deeply humiliating. After Pearl Harbor, December 41, Japan just swept through British territories. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma. They sank the battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales with air power, a huge shock. Why so undefended? The source suggests it's basically because Britain was stretched incredibly thin. Everything was focused on Europe, the Atlantic, the Middle East fighting Germany and Italy. There just weren't enough modern troops or equipment to defend a vast global empire, so key places were left tragically vulnerable. The fall of Singapore in Feb 42, 60,000 troops surrendering. That shattered Britain's image of imperial power. It boosted Indian nationalism and pushed Australia to look to America for security, not Britain.
And of course, for Britain, an island, the war at sea. That must have been absolutely fundamental. How did the Navy cope keeping those vital supply lines open?
Utterly critical, yes. The Royal Navy's job was huge. Protect merchant ships, hunt U-boats, blockade Germany, transport troops. They had a rough start, lacking air cover in places like Norway and Crete, leading to heavy losses, but they had big successes too. Think of the Fleet Air Arm crippling the Italian fleet at Taranto, hunting down and sinking the Bismarck in 41, and escorting those incredibly dangerous Arctic convoys carrying supplies to Russia, huge losses, but they got most ships through. The absolute core struggle, though, the Battle of the Atlantic, the fight against the U-boats. Allied shipping losses peaked terrifyingly in March 1943. Britain was close to being choked off. What turned it around? A combination of things. Long-range aircraft like the Liberator, closing the mid-Atlantic gap, better escort tactics, more escort ships, and new tech, crucially, centimetric radar in planes that could spot U-boats even at night. Winning that battle, just as important as Midway, El Alamein, Stalingrad. Without it, Britain couldn't have continued the fight, period.
And air power, beyond the Battle of Britain, what role did it play as the war moved into these later stages?
Air power became absolutely central. It wasn't just defense. It supported the Navy Toronto, sinking the Tirpitz. It protected the convoys. It was decisive in ground campaigns, the desert, Sicily, Normandy. Transport planes kept army supply, like in Burma. But then there's the controversial part, the strategic bombing offensive against German and Japanese cities. Germany started bombing civilians, but the Allies retaliated on a massive scale, targeting military and industrial sites, yes, but also explicitly aiming to break civilian morale. Places like Dresden, February 45, maybe 50,000 killed. Tokyo, March 45, 80,000 killed in one raid. Devastating.
Yeah, the bombing campaign, it's still fiercely debated today, isn't it? Effectiveness versus morality. How do the sources present that debate?
They present it as very contentious, absolutely. You have critics like Sven Lindquist, Jörg Friedrich calling it war crimes, blaming Churchill and Bomber Harris. They point to the huge Allied air losses, 158,000 in Europe, and the massive German civilian deaths, maybe up to 1 million. Was it morally justifiable? But then many British historians like Corelli Barnett push back hard, calling that view a historical travesty. They say it ignores the context of total war, ignores Nazi atrocities, Guernica, Warsaw, Rotterdam, the Holocaust. Richard Overy argues the bombing wasn't immoral in context and was strategically useful, disrupting Germany. Adam Tooze takes a stark line. If the war was right, the only question is, did bombing help win it effectively? He thinks it did. Peace campaigners like Bruce Kent agree it was war crimes, but stress the Nazis started it. Robin Nealon sees it as the terrible price of peace in a total war. And recent research. It suggests the bombing did become effective from late 1944 onwards, seriously hitting German production in the Ruhr oil arms. So maybe one of the decisive reasons for the Axis defeat. The source lays out these arguments, it doesn't pick a side.
Okay, so after all these different fronts, these different types of warfare, how did it all come together? How did the Allies finally defeat the Axis powers?
Well, Italy was the first domino to fall among the major Axis powers. Allies land in Sicily, July 43. Mussolini gets kicked out. Italy actually swaps sides. But the Germans dug in, so fighting there was bitter right up until May 45. Why was it important? Air bases closer to Germany, and it tied down German divisions needed elsewhere. Then, the big one, Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944. The timing was crucial. Italy basically out, U-boats mostly beaten, Allied air superiority achieved. Landing on those Normandy beaches was an incredible feat. They used amazing innovations like the Mulberry Harbors, the PLO fuel pipelines. That opened the door to liberating northern France, Paris, Brussels, Antwerp. And crucially, it opened in the launch sites for the German V weapons hitting Britain. The final push into Germany, well, it wasn't smooth. There were disagreements between Montgomery and Eisenhower on strategy. Eisenhower preferred a slower, broad front advance. Hitler threw everything into one last desperate gamble in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Hugely costly for Germany, losses they couldn't replace. By early 45, Germany's being squeezed from east and west. Berlin falls to the Russians in April. Hitler's dead. Germany surrenders May 7, 1945. Japan took a bit longer. America was dominant in the Pacific after Midway, doing that island hopping. Britain played a big part liberating Burma. But what ended it swiftly? The atomic bombs. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, August 1945. Now, Truman said it saved American lives from an invasion, but some historians argue Japan was already beaten, looking for peace terms. Another view. The bombs were maybe dropped to end the war before Russia could grab too much territory in Asia and to show American power to the Soviets for the coming Cold War. Admiral Leahy even suggested the scientists just wanted to test their expensive new toy.
So if you step back and look at the whole picture, why did the Axis lose? What's the fundamental reason they failed?
Fundamentally, they just bit off more than they could chew. Massively overreached. Hitler attacking Russia before Britain was out, declaring war in the U.S. That meant facing enemies with overwhelming combined strength. The Allies also learned. They figured out how to beat the Blitzkrieg. They finally understood the importance of air power, aircraft carriers. Italy, being an incompetent ally, didn't help Germany either, just drained resources. And resources were key. As the war dragged on, the Axis ran short of vital materials, especially oil. Meanwhile, the Allies, the combined power of the U.S., the Soviet Union, the British Empire was just staggering. Russia moved its industry east. The U.S., by 44, churning out 70,000 tanks, 120,000 planes a year. Germany and Japan just couldn't compete on that scale.
Right. The war's over. Victory. But how did this immense struggle change Britain itself, its people, its society, its place in the world?
For people at home, it was genuinely total war. Churchill's phrase, "the fronts are everywhere," was true. You had mass evacuations, Anderson shelters and gardens, blackout regulations, which actually caused a lot more road accidents, ironically, gas masks issued to everyone. The government got huge powers under the Emergency Powers Act. Rationing controlled everything: meat, cheese, sugar, tea, butter, jam, a point system for other things. But people mostly accepted it, felt it was fair. Dig for victory campaigns encouraged growing food. Shortages of everything, though. Mobilization was total, too. Conscription wasn't just for men. Unmarried women were drafted into war work. The land army, civil service, the home guard freed up regular soldiers. And the Blitz. German bombing was horrific. London hit 76 nights running. Coventry, Liverpool, other cities badly damaged. About 60,000 civilians killed, 100,000 seriously injured. Yet morale, remarkably, stayed high. And an interesting side effect. The war economy meant full employment for the first time since before World War I. Wages for workers actually rose faster than prices, partly because there were still strikes. Ernest Bevin did a brilliant job managing labor, getting everyone pulling together.
So daily life turned upside down. But did it actually cause a social revolution? Or was it more accelerating changes that were already happening? What's the historical consensus, if there is one?
That's the big question, isn't it? And historians are divided. Some definitely argue social revolution. Others, like Angus Calder or Henry Pelling, are more cautious. maybe just sped up existing trends or didn't change fundamentals that much. Arthur Marwick, though, makes a strong case that while you have to be careful, the war did bring about vital changes in attitudes. He points to 4 things. First, the economics. The sheer cost forced the government into Keynesian high spending and tax, which wiped out unemployment. People saw it worked in crisis and asked, why not in peace? Second, solidarity. That shared experience, the climate of common endeavor, made people much more willing to accept social spending. Things like free school milk, meals, nurseries started during the war, unthinkable before. Third, awareness. Middle and upper class families hosting evacuees were often shocked by the poverty and poor health of children from the cities. It really raised national consciousness. They deserve better. And fourth, the people's contribution. In a total war, the government needed everyone, the poor, women. There was a feeling they'd earned concessions. Plus, maybe a background fear of unrest if things didn't improve after the war. And this new thinking started shaping actual policy during the war. Churches, like Archbishop William Temple, were demanding more social responsibility. Think tanks proposed things like a Ministry of Social Security, an NHS. Then came the huge one, the Beveridge Report in 1942. It identified those 5 giant evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, idleness. Proposed comprehensive solutions: social insurance, child allowances, universal health, and education. It got massive publicity, huge public backing. Churchill was focused on winning the war, so only child allowances started then. But Beveridge established the principle of universality welfare for everyone, not just the more. That was key. And you also had the Butler Education Act in 1944, made secondary education free for all, raised the leaving age, a massive step for equality, letting more working class kids get ahead. Calder called it maybe the most important gesture towards democracy in the century. Even if not fully implemented yet, these ideas set the agenda for post-war Britain.
So, huge changes brewing domestically. What about the political scene? And maybe more profoundly, Britain's standing on the world stage after it was all over.
Politically, the most immediate result was Labour winning that landslide election in July 1945. The war had given them a clear reform program and the governing experience in the coalition. Trade unions were stronger too. Although some historians like Corelli Barnett argue a kind of complacency set in, a feeling that the British system had worked, so they focused on social reform but maybe neglected modernizing industry and infrastructure, which hurt later on. Economically, the war was devastating, gold reserves basically vanished, trade was shattered, war production took over everything. Lend-lease from the US was vital, but it meant Britain ended the war owing billions. Then came the shock. Truman just cut off Lend-lease abruptly. Britain was, as Keynes put it, virtually bankrupt. They had to take a huge U.S. loan with interest, took decades to pay off until 2006. As Andrew Marr says, it put Britain firmly under the economic control of the United States. And globally, Britain's position was transformed. The empire was still there, technically. But the defeats in Asia, especially Singapore, destroyed the myth of British superiority, fueled nationalism everywhere. Decolonization came fast afterwards. And the war made it undeniable. The USA and the Soviet Union were the new superpowers. Most historians agree Britain was now, despite being a victor, a former great power in decline. Had the psychology of winning, but the finances of losing? Maybe. Though some, like George Bernstein, offer a nuance. Maybe it was relative decline, not absolute. Britain got more prosperous after losing the empire. Perhaps shedding a burden. Marr suggests Britain just found a new role, junior partner to the U.S. in the Cold War. And unlike WWI, there was no big peace conference. Suspicion between Russia and the West was already too high. So, separate treaties, a divided world. The Cold War landscape was already forming.
We've covered so much. Britain's journey through that brutal war and the complex changed nation that emerged, it really was forged anew in that conflict.
It really was. And perhaps here's something for you to think about. If World War II really did cement this new idea of shared national responsibility, of welfare for all, as we saw with Beveridge and the Education Act, what does that tell us about the conditions needed for really radical social change? And crucially, do those kinds of conditions exist today?